My goodness. There we go. Okay, we are live. So apparently Andrew just decided I was Darth Vader and then it was the Borg who led the wise men to the, I don't know what's going on here, but welcome. We are in John chapter 7. We were just talking about the star because I have the Christmas star behind me from our Christmas play. But why don't we go ahead and start with prayer and then we'll dive right into John 7. Even though it says we have 0 viewers, but I guess I'll show up. And that counter never seems to work. Like there'll be like 8 people watching. It says there's like 3 viewers. So I don't know. Anyway, let's pray. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, shine within our hearts, loving Master, the pure light of divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds to the understanding of the message of your gospel teachings. Instill within us also the reverence for your blessed commandments, having trampled upon carnal desires. We may enter into a spiritual way of living, both thinking and doing only those things that are well-pleasing to you. For you, Christ God, our sanctification and illumination, we give glory to the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, now and forever in the ages of ages. Amen. Amen. Welcome. So we have a packed house. There's 2 people here with me. Oh wow, it's already kicked up to 3. So there are people here. Wonderful. So we'll jump right in. Chapter 7. It's not quite as big as chapter 6, so we can probably get through it in one lesson. But not only has it been a break for us of a couple weeks, actually, like 3 weeks or something, but it's also been a break of a few chapters. So one of the things that we've probably forgotten about that we need to have very clearly in our mind during this chapter was back in chapter 5, before the feeding of the 5,000 and then the discourse on the bread of life that we've been talking about for probably the last 3 sessions. But then because of the holidays, it was probably back in November. So it was a couple months ago that we talked about chapter 5. Chapter 5 was the healing of the paralytic that happened on the Sabbath. So keep that in mind because that's really important. We can jump right back there. So he went up to Jerusalem by the sheep gate, where it's called Bethzatha, and the guy that was at the pool and said, you know, when the waters are troubled, nobody throws me in. Maybe not throws me in. That's how I always think about it. So we just toss him off the side. But he cured him, and they said, well, who's been walking around? Why are you walking around with your thing? He said, well, the guy who healed me said I should do it. And then he talked to the authorities and says, you guys don't know what you're talking about because you search the scriptures, but you don't know their power. So that event plays very largely in this chapter, okay? When he talks about, there's kind of 2 things that happen in chapter 5 and chapter 6. Chapter 6, we talk about the bread of life. If you don't eat of my flesh and drink of my blood, you have no life in me. And then the disciples said, that's too much of a hard word, and they left, right? So all, the implication is even almost all but the 12, but there's probably some other straggled that didn't go. But this huge crowd that had come looking for miracles, looking for a political messiah, looking for somebody to take care of their material needs and feed them, whatever their reasons were, once they started saying, hey, here's some serious discipleship, they're like, no more. One of my classmates this last week when I was in my class told me about he does campus ministry, and a girl came to talk to him and was having troubles with her roommates and everything. And he said, yeah, well, it's really hard to work towards reconciliation and to forgiving each other. And she looked at him, she said, yeah, I'm not going to do that. And he said that was the moment she lost her faith. Like I looked right at her as she did it, and she hasn't come back. Wow. And he was like, but it was very interesting because he made the point that as soon as she realized, wait, this actually demands something of me, then yeah, I'm not interested in that. So that's kind of what was going on with the disciples, really. I mean, that's a kind of a modern contemporary example of that. But they're fine as long as they get bread and they get all these cool little miracles, and the sick get healed and the demons get cast out, and I get bread whenever I want it, and little pieces of fish and whatever it is. But then as soon as he says, oh yeah, but then by the way, you've got to do this, that, and the other. Ooh, I'm not sure I'm interested in that. So the people kind of the disciples, and he calls them the disciples. So we're so trained to think of the 12 as the disciples that we forget that there was a 12, there was a 70, and there was even a larger crowd. So this larger crowd was also called the disciples. That's going to come into this chapter when he talks about the disciples. The question becomes, what disciples is he talking about? Is the evangelist John talking about? But the very beginning of the chapter, and we'll read it and we can talk about it. After this, Jesus went about, this is John chapter 7, verse 1. After this, Jesus went about in Galilee. He would not go about in Judea because the Jews sought to kill him. There's this kind of weird transition from, I'm the bread of life, you must eat of me, eat of my flesh and drink of my blood if you want to have life in you. The disciples go, ooh, that's kind of weird. I don't think I really want to get into that. That sounds like a little bit just out of my comfort zone. And then he looks at Peter, what do you think? Well, with you is the words of life. And, that's kind of the end of chapter 6. And all of a sudden, now he can't go to Judea anymore. And you're going, wait a minute. That doesn't seem like that big of a deal. The big deal is back in chapter 5. The big deal is healing the man on the Sabbath. So now you have this teacher, this rabbi, who is gaining a following, a hearing, and he has demonstrated a willingness to abandon or undermine the Sabbath. So the religious authorities see him as undermining the faith of Israel. So he is dangerous because he's deceiving people and drawing them away from their faith. So that's why it was dangerous for him to go to Judea, because now he was becoming well known. Now people were talking about this Jesus guy up in Galilee who heals the sick, who drives out demons, who gives sight to the blind, who does, I don't know which one of those miracles have occurred at this point. I have to go back. It's been a while for me too. But at the very least, I mean, he changed water into wine. That's kind of a big deal. He's multiplied the loaves and the fish. Then he healed the sick, so all these things have happened, and you're kind of saying, okay. And at least the religious authorities see him as undermining the law, the Torah, so the Jewish law. That's a no-no. So now he's not just a random teacher talking about weird stuff. Now he is actually opposing the faith of Israel. So now they need to silence him, or they need to oppose him. So he can't go down to Judea. So you have, Galilee's up in the north, and then you have Judea down here, and then Samaria, of course, right in this little middle area. And that's why they have to go around it, but they go through it. And that's when he meets folks in the well, the Samaritan woman. And so they come down here to Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is where the temple authorities kind of hold sway. Galilee's kind of the boondocks. It's out there in the middle of nowhere. But anybody who wants to become anybody goes to Jerusalem. That's where you make a big splash. That's where, if you're going to have a following or have any kind of celebrity or fame, that's where you go. All right, we got that in the background. Good. So he can't go down to in Judea because the Jews sought to kill him. And by the way, when a lot of ink has been spilled about John and the Jews, what do the evangelists John think of the Jews? And they say, oh, well, this is very anti-Semitic. Some of these verses have been used for anti-Semitic purposes. Absolutely, notoriously so. The question becomes then, was John anti-Semitic, and did he intend to engender anti-Semitism? I mean, the answer, obviously, from the Orthodox Church's perspective is, of course not. But a lot of people will translate this, and it's actually maybe even a better translation, not instead of Jews, but the Judeans. Judei and the Judei, it's the exact same word, can either mean the Jewish people or the people in the region of Judea. It's pretty clear from John's gospel that when he talks about the Jews like this, he has in mind the religious authorities, the Sanhedrin, the Sadducees, some part of the Pharisees, the kind of the establishment that opposed him. And that's who he talks about as the Jews. Because sometimes he'll talk about the Jews, and then he'll say the crowd was, open to his teaching. Well, the crowd were Jews too. So just keep that in the back of your mind as you think about that. Now the Jews' feast of tabernacles was at hand. So his brothers said to him, well, we're not going to get through this very quickly. We got to talk about tabernacles. We're going to do 5 minutes for each verse. But this is actually important. It's really interesting too. So there are 3 big pilgrimage feasts in Israel. Obviously Passover, which then become Pascha. And then there's Pentecost, which was kind of a harvest. Is that the harvest festival? No, wait, Pentecost was the 50-day festival, so that it was the sheaves of grain. Tabernacles was the feast, and the one that we're talking about now, was a feast in September, October. It was when you started getting the first fruits of your vineyards. And so it was an offering of first fruits, but it was primarily grapes and olives that they would bring, and they'd have fruit, and they'd literally actually hold up fruit. They'd have like a candle in one hand and fruit in the other hand and be around the temple. And so it was kind of a harvest festival of Thanksgiving and everything else. religiously, it commemorated the Exodus. And so what they would do is they build a bunch of booths, right? Which would be like tents, kind of. It's almost like a NASCAR race. Everybody's going down the infield with their tents and everything, staying there. It was that kind of atmosphere too. The first day and the last day were kind of holy days, but then the 5 days in between. So it was actually 8 days, but it was a 7-day celebration. The 8th day, they didn't do the ritual activities, but we'll talk about that as we get a little bit further into it. So the first day and the 7th day, but then the middle was kind of parties. It was not parties, but festivities. It was celebration. And everybody, I think Josephus, one of the historians, said this was one of the most popular pilgrimage festivals because it was fun. And they would all come and they'd hang out in their booths. And the ritual part of it is they'd go to the pool of Siloam, which was where Christ healed the paralytic. That's why, so all this stuff starts to click in your heads. They would go there with golden pitchers and they would scoop the water up, the priest would, and then they would process up to the temple and they would pour the water from the pool of Siloam on the offerings. And they did this every day for 7 days. And then on the 8th day, kind of the final day, they didn't actually do that. And then at night, they would have these giant, candelabras or candles, and they would light them. And so it was kind of a festival of water and light. Chapter 7 is, I will make living water come from your hearts. Chapter 8 is, I am the light of the world. Okay, so you see how those two themes kick in? So what he's doing is you have to kind of understand the Feast of the Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths. Yeah, Tabernacles, yeah. Booths. In order to get what's going on. Because he's taking those two main images of the feast, water and light, and then he's applying them to himself. Okay, so the water reflected primarily the rock that Moses struck to cause the water to come out when they were thirsty in the desert and they had nothing to drink. And so then all of a sudden this water came out, and it was sweet, fresh water, and so they took it. But it's also calling into mind, and this all becomes important as we go, but it's also calling in mind Isaiah 55 that says, that you'll be thirst and you will drink. I mean, maybe Isaiah 51, I think it was at 55. It's either 51 or 55. I think 55. So we'll go there first. Yes. Everyone who thirsts, come to the waters, and he who has no money, come buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without price. So everyone who is thirsty, come and drink. So that was one of the images that would be in their mind. The other was Ezekiel 47. My numbers are always so, I've got it written down. I should probably just look at it. Ezekiel 47. Then he brought me back to the door of the temple, and behold, water was issuing from below the threshold of the temple toward the east, for the temple faced east, and the water was flowing down from below the south end of the threshold of the temple south of the altar. And then he brought me out by way of the north gate and led me around on the outside of the outer gate that faces toward the east, and the water was coming out at the south side. Now, this is important because in Ezekiel, it shows the water as originating at, did you hear what I just read? The temple. So the water was coming from the temple and pouring out of the temple, and then of course it pours out, and he actually takes them out, and it goes all the way down to the Dead Sea, and it refreshes the water there. So now you have groves of trees, and it basically turns into paradise. But the water's coming from the temple, right? And Christ is going to replace the temple with himself. He just replaced manna with himself, right? He replaced the temple with the Samaritan woman. He says, God will worship in spirit and truth. Will worship God in spirit and truth. So you see, he's this kind of continual, some might say subverting of, but it's really the fulfilling of the symbols of Israel. He's saying that these were icons pointing to me, and I'm here now, and I will fulfill them in my person. So a lot of times, we have these Bible studies and we talk about how, Jesus was so innocent and the authorities were being so, abusive and terrible. Actually, the authorities understood what he was saying. I mean, he was saying really threatening things about the temple and about their worship of God, that they had mastered the forms but had lost sight of the content. And then he comes up and he's actually like, I'm the content. And so that would have, when they're saying, we need to arrest him, we need to do these things, it was a pretty good reason. They had a pretty good reason to do it.
Well, they were afraid of losing what they had.
Now you can get the psychology of it. Exactly. So why weren't, and you even hear it here when we'll get there, when they're, Nicodemus is like, well, we haven't even heard him yet. And they're like, what, are you from Galilee too? It's like they've completely shut their minds off to it. They're like, I don't want to have this conversation. So there's no openness, to that, which is kind of the one big hint. It's kind of a big clue that says that they're not seeking the truth. They're seeking something else. And what are they seeking? Then, of course, power and prestige and money and everything else that we still seek after. So you've got this, the Feast of Tabernacles was at hand. So what happened is the feast was like the first day. That was the kind of the holy day. And then you had these celebrations, and then you kind of closed out the feast at the end. So the important time to be there, if you wanted to be seen, was the first day. Okay, that's going to play out in this next paragraph. So that's when you would show up if you wanted to be part of. It's kind of like the red carpet. That's when all the people who are going to be seen were going to be seen. And I might be emphasizing that a little bit too much, but you were there at the beginning. So the Jews' feast of the tabernacles was at hand. His brothers said to him, "Leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples may see the works that you are doing. For no man works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." For even his brothers did not believe in him. And then Jesus said to them, we'll get to that. So, first question, who are his brothers? Right? Oh, he had brothers. In the tradition of the Orthodox Church, right, stepbrothers. So it would have been that Joseph, the tradition, and I might even be capital T, Holy Tradition. But there's a book called the Proto-Evangelium of James, which is non-canonical, and there's a lot of things in that we kind of say no. It might be the one where, as a childhood, he raises a bird or something like that. But anyway, that might be the Gospel of Peter, but I'm not sure. But anyway, this talks about Mary a lot, and that's where we get a lot of the traditions of our feasts. So the presentation in the temple and those sorts of things. But one of the things it talks about, so Mary, her parents were very old. Joachim and Anna was barren and hadn't had a child, and so they were very old when they had her. So she was very young when they died. And the tradition is that they brought her to the temple, which would have been Zechariah, would have been the priest, which is kind of cool too. Brought her to the temple to be raised as a consecrated virgin, a temple virgin, which was not a common thing in Judaism. It's actually kind of an odd thing, but it was a thing if I understand the history properly. But it could have been something that was completely unknown of it. It was just Banaya. And then they died, and they left her when she was very young, like under 5. So she was raised there at the temple. And of course, within Holy Tradition, we understand her to have been raised actually having entry into the Holy of Holies, where angels fed her with manna. That doesn't play into this, but so her experience of all of this, and that's why when Gabriel appears to her, she's every other person that encounters an angel like passes out, and she's like, "What's up?" He's like, "Don't be afraid," and she's like, "Okay, but why are you talking to me?" And then he says these things, and she's kind of questioning him, but she'd had experience with angels before. So in order for her, so here's the way that the culture falls into it. So put aside all that, even the tradition, the Holy Tradition piece of it. At that time, women didn't have rights. Women were things. I'm sorry, but that's how they were considered in that culture. That's probably saying it too harshly, but they didn't have legal protection. Their legal protection was through a male. So this is also why Christ with the widow Nain was so concerned about her, because she was a widow, which meant her husband had died. Now her only son had died. And so there was no male figure to provide her legal protection, legal standing. So now Mary would have depended on the legal standing of her father Joachim in order to give her legal standing. So as soon as he died, now she was basically an orphan. So in order to protect her, there was a couple options. Well, there was really one option: marry her off, right? But when they put her to the temple and consecrated her to the temple, the intent was that she would be dedicated to God, so she would remain a virgin. Well, she got married, she's not remain a virgin, she can be raising some children somewhere. So now you have this problem of what do we do with Mary? And in Proto-Evangelium of James, it talks about Joseph lost his wife, and now he had children, but he had no one to raise them. So now you have a woman who needs the protection of a male for legal standing, and then you have a male who has children who needs a woman to help him raise his children. And so, being a pious Jew as well, he was the one who was identified to become the protector of Mary. And so they were betrothed. In the Orthodox tradition, they never did marry. They were betrothed, which then gives her legal standing under him. And then she cared for his children and raised them. And that was kind of the agreement. That puts in really stark relief the shock he would have felt when all of a sudden she's pregnant, because he's thinking, wait a second, yeah. The whole purpose of me being here with you was to provide this protection. So that whole understanding, I probably wouldn't into that too much detail, but the understanding would be that what am I getting? Oh, the brothers. I forgot. My train of thought derailed at the station. Sorry about that. The brothers would have been his older stepbrothers. And it's interesting because Protestants, when they read this, they have to make them his younger brothers, right? Because she was a virgin when she had Jesus, and then after that, whatever. But then she would have had children after that. So, but in our understanding, it's the older brothers, which makes sense because they kind of talk to him the way you talk to a younger brother. You want to go out there. Now, what's going on with this? What are they talking about? So they say to him, leave here and go to Judea that your disciples may see the work you're doing. So what disciples is he talking about?
12, right?
That's what your assumption would be.
Yeah.
I think he's pointing backwards to chapter 6, actually 6, verse 66, which is very interesting. So it's 666. But where it says that after this, many of his disciples drew back and no longer went about with him. So his brothers are like, look, you're doing all this cool stuff. So St. John Chrysostom even says, the problem with the brothers wasn't that they didn't believe, it's they didn't fully believe. They kind of were in this middle place of belief, which is why it says in there, they didn't believe. The evangelist John says, for even his brothers did not believe in him. And St. John Chrysostom interprets that they didn't fully believe in him. But why would they say, hey, go up there and get this, go up to the disciples, make a big splash, let people see you, that's how you do it. Well, so the way that that St. John Chrysostom saw it was, okay, he just lost all his disciples. He's been doing all these miracles. He's doing all these messianic kind of things. He's obviously kind of charismatic and he's got an ability to draw a crowd, and now he's lost his crowd. Well, what better way to regain your crowd than to go to this big, massive festival, start throwing out a miracle here or there, get some good teaching, and then all of a sudden your disciples would then see you in this very public sphere, and you'd be good to go, right? So it's strike while the anvil's hot. People are talking about you. People are curious. Just go out there, do a few miracles on the way, and by the time you get to Jerusalem, you'll have a big, massive following. And that's the idea, is that they would go start moving towards Jerusalem, and he would gather this gathering and he would get to Jerusalem. Now, what would happen with the religious authorities who felt threatened by him already, and he shows up with a big gaggle of disciples to Jerusalem? Give you a hint, it happens next spring.
Yeah, they tried to arrest him.
Right? Yeah. They'd arrest him and crucify him.
Yeah.
And he knew that his time was not now, which is very interesting. The way one of the commentators wrote it, he said his time was Pascha shaped and not tabernacle shaped, right? So his work was going to be a culmination in the fulfillment of Passover, not of tabernacles. It's kind of cool.
That is cool.
Right? So it wasn't time for him to press this confrontation with the authorities that was going to lead to his arrest and his execution. That was going to need to happen at Passover. So this wasn't his time. He says, it's not my time. It is Kerosh. It's not the Kerosh. It's not the proper time. This is not the time for me to consummate my work. I'm still moving in that direction. I'm building to the crescendo. It's not time for the crescendo. And his brothers are kind of, there's a little bit of mocking here too. It's like, hey, why don't you go and make a big deal if you're so special, You can kind of see a little bit of sibling rivalry, hey, if you're so great, why don't you go ahead and get a big crowd of people with you to tabernacles? if you do these things, show yourself to the world. So you're like, look, we've seen your miracles. We've heard your teaching. We know all this. You see what it does when you get with a big crowd of people. They all follow after you. So look, if you're trying to, if you're messianic, if you're somebody important, then draw the crowds and go accomplish what you're going to accomplish. It's the same thing that he does with the disciples. It's more in Mark than in the other Gospels. But they have the wrong idea. His brothers have the wrong idea. And remember, one of the themes in John is that we keep getting stuck in this worldly thinking and we don't understand the spiritual, which is a deeper reality. And we keep trying to make it about the here and now. So his brothers, in effect, and this is important, his brothers are encouraging him to seek out his own glory before men, right? You go, you make a big deal of yourself, you show the people who you are, you will gather a big following, do what you're doing in public, make sure it's seen so that you get to be glorified, right? And we're going to see Jesus flip this over and turn it in about 10 verses, which is really important. So the world cannot hate you. So, for even his brothers did not believe him. Jesus said to them, my time has not yet come. And there's that keros. My time has not yet come, but your time is always here. Okay? So he's making the distinction between worldly time and God's time, right? So you guys are working in this whole worldly realm, but I'm operating by a different set of rules. Your time is always here. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify of it that its works are evil. Go to the feast yourselves. I am not going up to this feast, for my time has not yet fully come. So saying, he remained in Galilee. And it's funny because a lot of the ancient manuscripts will add yet. I'm not going to the feast yet, because they're frustrated that Jesus lied. You know? But it's not that he's lying, obviously. He said, I'm not going up to the feast, and then understood he was saying he wasn't going up publicly. He wasn't going to make a spectacle of it. He was not going to make a show of going up to the feast. And he didn't go. He showed up after the beginning of it. So he missed that first, kind of the first part of it, to come in during the festivities and the celebration. Make sure I got all my notes here. Right, and when he's talking about the world, he's talking about the powers of this age. He's talking about the fleshly, earthly understanding of life, and that's a big deal. And the same theme that goes through John, where it's everybody keeps trying to think of it. You know, Nicodemus, how do I climb back into my mother's womb? I don't get that. You know, Jesus goes, that's not what I'm talking about. And Fotini, well, where's the Samaritan woman? Where's the water that you said you're going to get me? That's not really what I was talking about. I mean, every time he goes through this, they just don't get it, and his brothers are doing the same thing. And so he remains in Galilee. All right, so Jesus' mission is Pascha shaped, not tabernacle shaped. Okay, I think we got everything. But after his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he also went up, not publicly, but in private. And you're following along why, right? Okay. So he's not going to be seen. It's not going to make a big deal of it. But he goes up there because he still wants to be there, and he's got to teach and everything else. The Judeans were looking for him at the feast and saying, where is he? And there was much muttering about him among the people. While some said he's a good man, others said, no, he's leading the people astray. Yet for fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly of him. And that's what I mean. I mean, they're all Jews. So for fear of the Jews, they're not afraid themselves, right? For fear of the Jewish leaders. That's where you get that distinction in John. So I think one of the really interesting things that struck me when I was reading this is they were all talking about him, right? You know, everybody kind of left, and he's left with his little band of disciples, but still, he's the topic of conversation there at Tabernacle. So this shows just how much, how subversive or how shocking his healing would have been of the paralytic at the pool of Siloam. So they're like, he's been teaching. Did you hear what he did with the feeding the 5,000? I mean, it's like, where is he? 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 Who is he? Who is he? Who is he? Who is he? Everybody's trying to figure out who this prophet, rabbi, teacher, who he is. And again, all this was instigated by his healing on the Sabbath. So keep that in the back of your mind, because that's what's going on. About the middle of the feast, So now we're in those days of festivities. About the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and taught. The Jews marveled at him, saying, "How is it that this man has learning when he has never studied?" Okay, so saying this man, they're being condescending. Okay, there's a note of mockery there. Like, how's this guy? This is some peasant from Galilee. What's up with that? This guy, I don't know what's going on with him. So there's two issues that the Judeans, the Jewish authorities have. The first issue is he broke the Sabbath, and he's showing other people to break the Sabbath. He's undermining the Sabbath, and so he's undermining the law of the Torah. That's a big no-no. The other thing is that rabbis in Israel were almost apprenticed down. So there was a pedigree, as it were. And so, if you were Hillel, and then you were your teacher, you trace back. Although I think Hillel might have been after this time. Was he after? I don't know. I don't know enough about the rabbinical schools. There's two big ones. But anyway, you were known by your teacher, a disciple of the teacher, a disciple of this, a disciple of this. They could kind of trace that lineage back. And then Jesus shows up and they're like, "Who's your teacher?" And he's like, "God." Right? And so they're like, "Wait, we don't know who your teacher is." So he didn't have the credibility because he didn't have the proper credentials. He wasn't talking about himself the right way. That's why they're saying, "Who is this man?" But then they're listening to his teaching and being like, "Oh, wait, he's pretty clever." And we'll see it down here when he says, circumcision is from Moses. He's like, "Well, it's not really from Moses. I know everybody thinks it's from Moses, but it's really from the fathers. It's from Abraham and the patriarchs." But people consider it, So he would put in these little details, and people would be like, "Oh, wow, he knows this stuff. He's read it. He gets it." But we don't know who his teacher is. And so how do we figure out how to place him, how to pigeonhole him? So those are the two main issues. He's subverting the Sabbath, undermining the Torah, and he doesn't have a lineage. They don't know who he is. So he's going to answer those. That's why I brought him out, because he's going to answer those two things. That's what he does in his answer. How's this man is learning when he's never studied? So Jesus answered them, "My teaching is not mine, but is he who sent me." Okay, so he pretty baldly says, my rabbi is God. Right? So I am, the teaching, it goes from God to me to you, which is a ambitious claim, to say the least. "My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. If any man's will is to do his will, he shall know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking of my own authority." "He who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory, but he who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there is no falsehood." Okay, so he's doing two things here. The first is he says, okay, my teaching comes from God. Now, I love this next one because we could abuse it a whole lot, right? He says, and it's from God because if you were really seeking after God, you'd recognize it was from God. Now, there's actually a very profound truth there if you don't abuse it. But the idea is, how do I do this? So if you hear a song by Ed Sheeran, you guys know who Ed Sheeran is? He's a new pop singer. He's really good. I like him, actually. But he's got a fairly identifiable sound. You know it's from him. Nobody has to say, well, it's, he uses this minor chord here. He's got these lyrics. He's got this, vamping here. And they don't have to break it down, all the technicalities. You just know what it sounds like. You go, oh, yeah, okay, that's Ed Sheeran. So the same thing, he's saying, look, when you've developed an ear for God, then you hear him. You just, you know it's true. So if you guys are faithful and actually seeking after God, then you'll see that what I'm telling you resonates with God. Now, that's a hard thing for us to talk about in our culture. And just even from my class last week, it was very interesting because, you have to provide citation and everything else for everything you say. You can never just say, even I couldn't say, well, in the Orthodox church, we teach this. How long ago did you start teaching that? Where did it come from? Where's this? You have to really break it on down. But that's kind of flipped over from the way that we do things. And it's hard in the West because we want to have this very concrete, traceable, kind of exactly what the Jews are saying. Well, who's your teacher and who was your teacher before that? And who's that teacher and where these ideas come from? And then Jesus is saying, no, listen, if you loved God, you would hear what I'm telling you is in harmony with who God is. It's the same thing where people say, oh, well, Kelly said this. I'm like, oh, it doesn't sound like Kelly. I don't have any proof to offer that, but I know Kelly. And so Jesus is saying, if you know God, then his words will resonate and you'll hear them in what I say to you. which, like I said, is a very difficult concept to embrace within kind of Western rationalistic culture. But that is what he's saying. There's really no way around that. He's saying, look, if you followed after God, if you knew the voice of God, you would hear his voice in mine. And it's a very bold claim, but it's exactly the claim that the church makes. If you encounter God, and if you know God, then you will hear his voice through the voice of the church. And that's a reverse of the way most people do things. Most people are, let me understand what you're saying. Actually, I think I wrote it down. Yes, here we go. Do we judge if someone is from God because they conform to our expectations of who God is? Or do we know God well enough to recognize when someone is from him? Right? So let me, because this is an important point, and I think I'm making it badly. So let me give you an example. Jesus broke the Sabbath by healing on the Sabbath. My expectation of God is that he keeps the commandments. So the Messiah coming in the name of God would keep the commandments as well. Jesus doesn't keep the commandments. Therefore, he cannot be God, right? So I have an expectation of what God is like. You don't conform to those expectations, so that's it. So I'm judging you according to my expectations of God, right? Jesus is saying, if you've actually encountered God, and this goes against our whole hyper intellectualization of everything, it's just ideas about God. Now I have to, see if you conform to all that. But he's saying, no. If you've met God, if you actually have a personal encounter with God in the way that's meant in the East, then you will recognize him in what I do. So now, and he's going to go through this in detail in just a second, he's saying, when I healed on the Sabbath, I wasn't breaking the Sabbath. I was fulfilling the Sabbath because that's who God is. And God seeks after our healing, and God seeks after our wholeness. That's what true Sabbath is to rest in God and the wholeness of our being. So if you knew God, you could see past your expectations and you'd say, oh, of course, that's what Sabbath meant. Now I see it. Do you understand how that works? The problem is that to our ear, that sounds very subjective, right? But to Christ and to the church, it's not a subjective thing. God is not subjective, although he's a subject, but that's a whole, how do we get caught up in weird philosophy, right? So to know God is to recognize his voice and recognize his actions. Got it? Which is actually a very difficult challenge to us, because then we have to ask ourselves, am I judging the church, Christians, everything else by my expectations of who they're supposed to be? Or have I had a living encounter with God such that I recognize him in the life of those around me?
And are the Jewish leaders understanding what he's saying? I guess we're going to get to that.
Oh, when he's saying...
Yeah, when he says that.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. That's why they send people to arrest him and kill him. Right? Because he's saying, hey, if you knew God, you'd see, you would recognize what I'm doing. And then, so that was his first answer. What I'm telling you comes from God. So by whose authority, who's your teacher? God. And the second thing is an answer to his brothers, right? His brother said, go seek your glory. And what does he say? If I was seeking my glory, it would be false. But I'm seeking the glory of the one who sent me. So that whole first part about him not going up when his brothers told him to go up to is the proof of what he's saying. Right? So he says, I don't seek my own glory. I seek the glory of he who sent me. And when we're reading carefully, we go, well, yeah, of course. He didn't go up to the feast to try to be famous. He's not seeking after his own glory. He's seeking after the glory of his Father, because he's following the Pascha-shaped contours of his mission. Does that make sense? So I'm not seeking my glory because I didn't go try to get attention to myself. I'm seeking God's glory. I have a theory. This theory, which is mine, is my theory. Yeah, Monty Python. Very good. Now we get to Moses. right? He seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there's no falsehood. So he's saying, I'm speaking the truth because I'm not seeking my own glory. I'm seeking the glory of the one who sent me. Did not Moses give you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. Right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, he doesn't pull punches. He's like, oh, you guys are mad at me because I broke the Sabbath? Well, now here's what he's saying. You are trying to kill me, which is what he's going to cause a little bit of controversy here in a second. He said, you've sent men to arrest me and kill me, which kind of breaks the law. Thou shalt not kill. So Moses gave the law. You're claiming the seed of Moses, but you don't keep the law. You're upset with me for breaking this one little part of the law, and you're about to kill me for it. So you're not keeping the law either. So if the rule is who keeps the law, we're all out of luck. Right? So that's the argument. Did not Moses give you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. Why do you seek to kill me? You guys are trying to kill me. And then we get this other audience, right? Now we hear, this is what we do when we read scripture. We don't notice these little distinctions, right? So we were imagining in our heads this big crowd of Jews around him, right? He's been talking about the Jews, the Jews, the Jews. And he says, well, the crowd says this. And we go, well, the crowd is all the Jews. Or not. The Jews are the Judean leaders who do seek to kill him in secret because they fear the crowd of Jews, but the crowd are the ones who are kind of listening to Jesus and thinking, oh, okay, that's a little bit bold. I'm not sure I want to go with that, but oh, I really like that. And that bit about healing people. And oh yeah, and hey, now, so they're the ones that are kind of open to it. So here he is having this conversation, this big giant crowd, and the authorities are saying, whose authority are you doing this by? He says, well, it's the Father's authority. I seek his glory. And they're like, yeah, but you're breaking the Sabbath. And he goes, yeah, well, Moses gave you the law and you don't even keep the law. You're trying to kill me. And all of a sudden the crowd goes, whoa, who's trying to kill who? Right? They don't know what's going on. And so they react harshly. The people answered, you have a demon. Who's trying to kill you? Because they don't know anything that's going on. They don't know about the plotting. Right? So you have a demon. Nobody's trying to kill you. You're being deranged.
That's what they mean. You have a demon. You're being deranged. In other words, they think it's
no. They would really they literally think. I mean, in that, it's interesting because I was just reading a book about that.
It's a weird response to his. Why are you trying to kill me? He's talking to the authorities, but yet the people's response is, "You have a demon." They're talking about faith,
right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, but we're importing modern ideas back into it. I mean, we have kind of a distinction in our mind. Actually, we've dismissed demonic possession entirely. We think everything is psychological and some kind of a mental thing. I know, yeah. But in general, I mean, within our culture, we don't even think about that. Now, they were the opposite of the extreme where everything was of demonic origin. They didn't understand mental illness. But there's still, I mean, okay, there's something wrong with you. You've got a demon. You're talking crazy talk now, right? Who's seeking to kill you? Jesus answered them. Kind of ignores it, just keeps going. I did one deed, and you all marvel at it. So what's the one deed he did?
Fish or the
healing the paralytic, right? That's exactly what he has in mind. Which, by the way, I've been making it a big deal, so it sounds obvious. But when you read this, you'd be like, "What one thing did you do?" But he very much has in mind the healing of the paralytic. I healed somebody on the Sabbath, and you guys are all up in arms about it. You're freaked out because you think I broke the Sabbath. So I did one deed, and you all marvel at it. Moses gave you circumcision. Not that it was from Moses; it was from the fathers. But kind of in the popular imagination, Moses, taught them about circumcision, even though it goes all the way back to Abraham. And he's saying, well, and that's why they thought, wow, he teaches with authority, because he even recognizes these little details, of the Torah. He's like, oh, it's Moses. Well, you guys think this really goes back to the fathers, but Moses. Moses gave you circumcision, not that it was from the fathers, and you circumcise a man upon the Sabbath, right? So if the 8th day after his birth is a Sabbath, you'll go ahead and circumcise him. And by the way, this is very clearly delineated within Jewish practice. And it was very clearly understood as a violation of the Sabbath. It was work that was done. But then it said circumcision supersedes the Sabbath. And what an extraordinary covenant it is. I mean, they talk in these terms. So it was understood in their own self-conception that to circumcise was to violate the Sabbath. Okay, so that's why Jesus is bringing it up. He's saying, okay, look, well, Moses told you to circumcise. And even if that happens on the 8th day, what do? You circumcise him. And then he says, if on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision, so the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well? So he's kind of playing off it. He's saying, you're worried about him breaking the Sabbath for this one little part. And I'm talking about his whole being. To bring his one part into conformity with the law, you'll violate the Sabbath. For me to bring his entire body into wholeness and fullness, you're condemning me. So he's kind of pointing out this sense of hypocrisy. He's like, look, within your own practice of the law, you've already identified an exception, which is more petty than the exception that I made for it, right? At least that's the thrust of the argument. On the Sabbath, a man receives circumcision, so the law of Moses may not be broken. Are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a whole man's body well? Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment, right? So if you're going to make comments, at least make them make sense. Very good. How are we doing? Yay. Some of the people of Jerusalem therefore said, so now you got the people of Jerusalem, and they recognize that the authorities are trying to arrest him. It's kind of weird if you don't think about these separate kind of groups of people. This chapter seems kind of strange because they're trying to kill him. They're not trying to kill him. You're crazy because you think people are trying to kill you. Oh, then this guy they're trying to kill, and back and forth, you're getting confused about it. It's because there's different groups. Okay. I would want to even make it more particular and say that the people in Jerusalem knew about the leader's desire to have him arrested, but the people coming to the feast from outside Jerusalem didn't necessarily know about that. And I'd almost make that particular thing, but that's being added into the text. We just have these groups of people in the text. So some of the people of Jerusalem therefore said, is not this the man whom they seek to kill? And here he is, speaking openly, and they say nothing to him. Can it be that the authorities really know that this is the Christ? Right? So they're saying, wait, I thought this is the guy they wanted to kill, and now he's sitting right in front of them, and he's saying this stuff right in front of them, and they're not doing anything. So maybe they secretly believe him. Okay? But they're still thinking in earthly terms, right? They're still thinking, okay, this stuff, there's no sense there's any kind of a spiritual sovereignty at play here. So maybe they think that this is the Christ. They're kind of, you can almost see them, their wheels turning. So what's going on? Okay, so maybe he is the Christ. Yet, we know where this man comes from, and when the Christ appears, no one will know where he comes from. So now, there's actually two threads of thought within Jewish messianic kind of intertestamental messianic expectation between the Old Testament, New Testament, is they knew he was going to be born in Bethlehem, but they weren't sure where he came from. Okay, and both those threads are kind of there. You can find that. So there's this kind of sense they didn't know where he came from. Now, obviously, Jesus fulfills that in a very particular way because he's from Bethlehem, which we know, by the way, as readers of this, we know he's born in Bethlehem. That's going to come really important in the next page. So we know he's from Bethlehem, but we also know that his origin is not of this earth. So his origin is not earthly, and so we don't really know where he's from. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's what we're playing on right here. Is they're saying, and that's why, by the way, the prophecies are confusing because some of them are saying we don't know where he's from, and the others are saying he's born in Bethlehem. And Christ, of course, then fulfills those because he was born in Bethlehem, but also his origin is of an unknowable, unexpected source. So Jesus proclaimed, and by the way, grazo, he cried out, which is really quite a striking, so it's like he's yelling out, he's crying out in the temple. As he taught in the temple, you know me and you know where I come from, but I have not come of my own accord. He who sent me is true, alithinos, and him you do not know. I know him, for I come from him, and he sent me. So they sought to arrest him, but no one laid hands on him because his hour had not yet come. And that's one of those things when we read scripture, you're kind of going, they tried to arrest him for that? Really?
That's a pretty bold claim, yeah.
It's a very bold claim when you start reading it, when you start understanding it. He's going, oh, you think you know me. You say you know where I'm from, and what you know me, you know from where I come from. Not so much. What you think you know is very earthly and fleshly. You're not seeing the other side of the coin, which is my spiritual, that's probably not the right way of saying it, but I have come not of my own accord. Him who sent me is true, and him you do not know. Now, this true, alithinos, is used in a very particular way by John. And I didn't even notice it here. But when he says, I am the true vine, I am the true light, I am the true life, that truth carries this idea of that being part of the heavenly realm rather than the earthly realm. So he's saying that, I am the true vine. He's saying I am the vine in the sense not of your worldly understanding, but in the sense of the eternal understanding. And the same thing. So when he says that God is true, he who sent me is true, he's saying that the one who sent me is part of this eternal heavenly realm, which of course the claim would then be, I am from the eternal heavenly realm.
Yeah.
Right? And him you don't know. I know him, for I come from him, and he sent me. So it's about knowing God. It kind of fits in with what he's talking about before. If you knew God, you'd recognize me. He even says that to Philip later on. So they sought to arrest him, but no one laid hands on him because his hour had not yet come. It wasn't time for his crucifixion. Yet many of the people believed in him and said, when the Christ appears, will he do more signs than this man has done? Which is interesting because there wasn't really a messianic expectation that he'd be a miracle worker. But they're saying, look, this guy's off the charts. He's nobody's seen anything like this. So what prophet could be more impressive or more convincing than this? And that's a problem for the authorities, because now, he chased them all off with this whole bread of life talk. And now they're like, oh, wait. And they're starting to kind of come around to him again. So the Pharisees heard the crowd thus muttering. Oh, by the way, this muttering, gongizo, it's a really cool word. I like to say it. It's the same word that the Israelites murmured in the desert. So it keeps coming back to that. So the Feast of Tabernacles is talking about the desert. And then this gongizo and all these other, the muttering. They heard the crowd thus muttering about him, and the chief priests and the Pharisees sent officers to arrest him. So in the middle of the feast. Keep this in mind, because there's a little space of days here. So they seem to, and Jesus then said, I shall be with you a little longer, then I shall go to him who sent me. You will seek me, you will not find me. Where I am, you cannot come. And of course, he's talking about ascending to the Father. And they're thinking worldly, fleshly. He's thinking something else. And I'm going to zip through this a little bit because we're getting close to being out of time. The Jews said to one another, where does this man intend to go that we shall not find him? Again, how am I supposed to go to my mother's womb again? They're just understanding it in very earthly terms. Does he intend to go to the dispersion among the Greeks and teach the Greeks? Which is kind of ironic because that's what ends up happening with the gospel. What does he mean by saying, you will seek me and you will not find me, and where I am, you cannot come? And of course, the literary irony here is that we know exactly what he means. He's going to ascend to the Father. On the last day of the feast, the great day, and by the way, there's nothing in Jewish literature that calls it the great day. The evangelist John's the one who calls it the great day. So we're not sure if this was the 7th day of the feast or the 8th day of the feast. Because the 7th day would have been the last day of festivities, and the 8th day would have been technically the last day of the feast. So it's either the 7th or the 8th day. And it colors the story a little bit differently, but the point's the same. And I'll show you what I'm talking about in a minute. So on the last day of the feast, the great day, Jesus stood up and proclaimed, if anyone thirst, let him come to me and drink. He who believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart shall flow rivers of living water. It's actually kilia. It's almost like his guts, out of my, innards. But we make it heart because we don't talk about innards in American culture, in Western culture. But the idea is almost from the very core and depth of their being. Out of his heart shall flow rivers of living water. Now this he said about the Spirit, which those who believed in him were to receive, for as yet the Spirit had not been given, because Jesus was not yet glorified. And John, when he says glorified, always means his lifted up. The glorification is being lifted up. So, and I'm kind of hitting the accelerator a little bit here because we got like 5 minutes left. We'll go over a little bit. Sorry. I know I always do. I'll try not to make it too far over. So if it's the 7th day, then he likely said this as the priests were pouring the water on the sacrifices. Yeah. Right? Imagine him standing up in the midst of that and saying, if anyone thirsts, let them come to me and I will make living water rise out of their hearts, right? I mean, it would have been a very striking moment. But if it had been the 8th day, it would have been the first day that they didn't pour the water out, and it would have been something was missing because they weren't pouring the water out, and he would have said, anybody who thirsts, come to me, and out of his heart shall flow rivers of living water. So the point is the same, just however the dramatic feel of it was. Either if it was the 7th day, like I said, there would be water. If it was the 8th day, there's no longer the water being poured out. So remember what I highlighted. The feast would have called to mind this, the temple in Ezekiel, the water welling up from the temple and flowing out into the world. And in the midst of, because remember, this image would have been sitting right there in their mind. They just spent 7 days celebrating this and recalling and celebrating. And then all of a sudden Jesus says, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. Now, living water could just mean running water. Like a river was called a living water. But it's obviously got this kind of double entendre thing going on. Out of his heart shall flow rivers of living water. So he's, again, subverting this idea of the temple being the site of worship. With the Samaritan woman, he said, it's not going to be worshiped at that temple. It's going to be worshiped in spirit and truth. Now he's saying the water's not coming from the temple per se. It's coming from me, who am the true temple of God. See how that works? It's pretty cool. So when they heard these words, some of the people said, this is really the prophet. And others said, this is the Christ. So now you're getting these groups of people. The prophet. Now, whether it was the prophet, some people thought, the prophet after Moses, we've talked about kind of being the new Moses. Other people would have thought of him. I forgot. It wasn't Jeremiah. There was also this kind of expectation that one of the prophets would be the one who preceded the end of times. And so they're saying maybe it's that prophet. But anyway, they've got these different schools of thought. It's the prophet, it's the Christ. We've seen this before in John's gospel. Who do men say that I am? Some people say you're a prophet, some people say. But some said, is this the Christ to come from? But then some said, is the Christ to come from Galilee? Galilee, I mean, nobody gives Galilee a break. Everybody's giving it a hard time.
It's like New Jersey.
I know, exactly. Is anything good to come from New Jersey? That's what we should say. Sorry, guys, New Jersey. But some said, is the Christ to come from Galilee? Has not the scripture said that the Christ is descended from David and comes from Bethlehem, the village where David was? This is like a paragraph away from, nobody knows where the Messiah is supposed to come from. And now they're going, Bethlehem of David. Yeah. So you see those two streams kind of coming together. But the point is exactly the same, that they're getting caught up in technicalities. They're getting caught up in secondaries. And they're letting that obscure their vision to what's happening. As he says, he's supposed to come. And by the way, this is the only place that John mentions Bethlehem. Okay? Which is kind of interesting. The evangelist John. So has not the scripture said that Christ is descended from David and comes from Bethlehem, this village where David was? So there was a division among the people over him. Some of them wanted to arrest him, but no one laid hands on him. Okay, so you now got to have this group. Now here's what's really interesting, okay? Is he a prophet? Is he the Christ? Well, I guess he could be the Christ. He's doing all the things of Christ. But no, the Christ is supposed to come from Bethlehem, remember? Right? Now, back off literary irony. What do we know that they don't know? Where was Jesus born? Right?
Yeah.
Okay. So am I using that right? Literary irony is knowing something that they don't know in the story?
Yeah.
Right? Okay. So that irony plays into it because now their one big objection to Jesus being the Christ is that he wasn't born in Bethlehem. And what do? Yeah, he was. Oh, wow. There's no reason not to believe that he's a Messiah because we know, in fact, that he was born in Bethlehem. And so now the only objection that they can come up with is a false objection. So that's kind of a little subtle thing going on there. He's saying, oh, yeah, well, the Christ is supposed to come from Bethlehem. And we're all going, oh, that's where he's from. But they don't know it. Now, so all this has gone on, the middle of the feast, the officers went to arrest him. Now we're at the last day of the feast. It's been a couple of days, and the officers go back. Think about this. Go arrest this guy. And then 3 days later, they come back. Like, where have you been?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the church fathers, I found it interesting because a couple of the modern commentators wrote about this. And I'm like, I think you're pushing it. And then when I looked at the fathers, all of them were like, the soldiers, the guards came to faith. They're saying they believed, they heard him speaking, and then they came to faith. It's kind of interesting. And I think it's supported by the text. So the officers then went back to because they'd been sitting there for 2 or 3 days listening to him. Go arrest him. They get out there and they hang out and they're like, ooh, that's kind of cool. We're going to come back tomorrow. Yeah, let's come back tomorrow. They come back the next day, the next day, the next day. And then they say, okay, we got to go back to the Pharisees at some point. The officers then went back to the chief priests and Pharisees, who said to them, why did you not bring him? Go arrest this guy. They come walking back. It's like, where is he? The officers answered, well, there's a big crowd. We thought they would riot. We didn't think it was safe to pick him up then. That's not what they say. The officers answered, no man ever spoke like this man. And that's one of those verses that we pull out all the time. People are always like, even 2,000 years later, no man ever spoke like this man. No one ever spoke like this man, because this man is the Son of God, the Messiah, right? And so that's St. John Chrysostom talks about how the boldness to proclaim Christ, to them. They don't make excuses. They don't say, hey, you know what? They just say, no, we're not going to arrest him. This guy, nobody ever spoke like him before. And so the Pharisees, their only answer, the Pharisees answer them, are you led astray also? Because they were. Have any of the authorities or the Pharisees believed in him? Now, the authorities are really depicted as being pretty arrogant and condescending. And right now what they're saying is like, look, you people are stupid. None of us have followed him. We're smart. So if none of the smart people have followed him, don't be stupid, right? That's exactly what their argument is. Have any of us followed after him? No. Therefore, you don't know any better. You should do what we do. And that's the in totality of their argument. And the authorities of the Pharisees believed in him, but this crowd who do not know the law are accursed. They're not smart like me. They don't know the law because they're following after this Jesus fella, right? So Nicodemus, who had gone to him before and who was one of them, said to them, does our law judge a man without first giving him a hearing and learning what he does? Now, this is ironic on 2 levels. The first is, have any of us gone after him and followed him? And Nicodemus is like, I did, right? So within the narrative, of course, they don't know this because he does it in secret. But within the narrative, we're already going, again, the same thing. We have this linearity. Oh, he's from Bethlehem. We're going, oh, I know this. He's from Bethlehem. And now the Pharisees are like, it would be okay to believe in him if any of us had followed him, but none of us have followed him, so it's not okay to follow him. And then all of a sudden, Nicodemus is brought up, and we're going, oh, yeah, that's right. Nicodemus did follow him. Yeah. So now this objection becomes ironic in the fullest sense of the word, because we know that one of their members, one of the authorities, has indeed sought after Christ. Okay? And the second irony at play here is he says, does our law permit us to kill somebody without hearing from them? And what do they just accurse the people for? Those people don't know the law. Let them be accursed. And then Nicodemus goes, about that not knowing the law accursed business, maybe you shouldn't be so eager to kill someone, which the law prohibits, without a hearing. So we should at least talk to the guy first, right? So pretty reasonable. He's not saying anything really crazy. He is kind of popping their balloon a little bit. But then he says, does our law judge a man without first giving him a hearing and learning what he does? They replied, are you from Galilee too? I mean, it's like they can't even engage the conversation in any kind of a civil way. They're like, oh, you're from Galilee. Bunch of New Jersey people. Are you from Galilee too? Search and you will see that no prophet is to rise from Galilee. Now, a couple funny things about this, and we're done. That's the very last verse. The word for rise is exactly what you think it is. It's no prophet is anesti, is risen, yeah, which is the same word we use for the resurrection. Yeah. So it's a very interesting little word. It's one of the frustrations with reading and translation. We don't get those things. I mean, it is the word to rise, and that's exactly what it means. But when we hear that, it would have had that kind of resonance And we'd go, oh, wait, that's that same. So we'd be thinking about resurrection, right? So obviously it's kind of a little bit of a dig there. Is any prophet, arisen from Galilee? Now, the other part of the irony of this is Jonah and Hosea, who are from Galilee. So the answer to the question, is any prophet arisen from Galilee, is yeah, there's two. One of them was buried 3 days in the belly of a great fish and then came alive again. And then the other one prophesied about a third-day resurrection. So, so now, again, this is one of the frustrations with us reading the Bible. And I'm not saying that you all are biblically illiterate. I'm saying that we are biblically illiterate as a culture. I didn't know that. I've read this a bunch of times. And it's funny because only a couple, I think it's only one of the commentaries actually said, hey, we went back and looked, and here's the two prophets that are from Galilee. And isn't it neat that they both have a connection to resurrection?
Yeah.
And now you have Arise, the two prophets that are from Galilee that are brought to mind when we say no prophets from Galilee. You see how it all resonates together? But we just don't have that biblical literacy for that stuff to echo. So that's why we need Bible study. That's my plug for why we do Bible study, is because we just, if somebody doesn't, I mean, it's what the Ethiopian eunuch says to Philip. He says, if nobody is to guide me, how am I supposed to understand these things? So hopefully that enriches our reading. Hopefully that helps us to enter into the gospel a little bit more fully. That's a really interesting chapter. So this is the Great Feast of Tabernacles. That was the first part of it, chapter 7. The second part is chapter 8, which is the light. He says, I am the light of the world. Now, interposed in there is this little story of the adulteress, the woman caught in adultery. He says, he who's without sin cast the first stone. That is not in most ancient manuscripts. Yeah, Augustine even said, people tried to take this out because they thought that the people would commit adultery if they thought that Jesus would forgive them. It's really interesting. So, I mean, from the very beginning, that's not there. Most modern commentators will recognize that it goes from no prophet to rise from Galilee at the end of chapter 7 all the way to verse 12. Again, Jesus spoke to them saying, I am the light of the world. He who follows me not walk in darkness. That transition makes more sense. This little story interpolated makes no sense. Also, it's not always put here. Sometimes it's put at the end of the Gospel of John. Sometimes it's put at the end of the Gospel of St. Luke. And even some scholars go, well, the language, the echo sounds more like Luke than it does John anyway. And there's all these kind of redaction, criticism, whatever you call it. But this is where it is in Scripture, and that's where we'll consider it. And it does seem to fit in here, although it likely was not written by John. It was inserted later because it resonates with certain parts of the story. But having said that, that's what we'll start with next time, is the story of the adulteress, the woman caught in adultery, which is actually one of my favorite stories. So everybody's like, we should just not even have, and some commentators just skip it entirely. Don't even say anything about it. They just go straight to verse 12 and don't even talk about this. So I'm kind of going, it's a really, so here's an exact example of what I was talking about. All the scholarly debate and study and everything goes, yeah, that doesn't fit there. It's not, and pretty clearly isn't. But doesn't it sound like Jesus?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, don't you just hear that and go, oh yeah. Now, most scholars will also say that it has the feel of historicity about it. They do think that this is actually an event from Christ's ministry. Just where you place it within the canon is confusing to them. But it has the right flavor. It reflects the God that we worship, which is kind of fun. With that, I made it under, so it's 8:09. Oh, we did good.
You covered verse 53, and everyone.
Verse 53 kind of
own house.
That goes because that goes with chapter 8, because it creates this division there. Everybody left and went to their own house, and then this thing happened with the adulterers, and then Jesus started talking about the light on the hill. But the light, I am the light of the world, probably goes during this debate with the temple authorities. So as he's talking about the water, and then Nicodemus saying, hey, wait a second, this little interlude of the soldiers going back, and the leaders saying, nothing good comes from Galilee, and are you from Galilee too? There's no prophets come from there. And then it shifts back to Jesus in the temple, still continuing his teaching on the last day of the great feast. So that the setting is the same as chapter 7 for the back half of chapter 8. With this, that's one of the reasons that scholars are convinced that was kind of slipped in there. So then they went each to his own home, goes with the story of the woman caught in adultery.
It's also apropos because we're going home.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. That was your whole point. I went off on this whole scholarly thing. Well, actually, and you're just going, I want to go home. Yeah, okay. Then each went to his own home because Andrew wants to go home. Very good. Awesome. Okay, I see everybody there. Thank you for following along. It was a great joy. Let's have our prayer to complete, and then we will finish this Bible study.
O holy apostle and evangelist Luke, make intercession to our merciful God, that he grant our souls remission of offenses.
Lord Jesus Christ, our God, please watch over these, your servants, guide them safely to their homes, watch over them, guide them, protect them. And Lord, let your living water flow forth from us all as we enter into your church, as we let your love and presence be made known to all. For your holy name, forever in the ages of ages. Amen. Isn't it perfect that this comes right during Theophany too? We're going to go do all the blessing of the houses and have the water go out. Very good. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful evening, and we will sign off. God bless you all. Bye-bye.